Hello, Dr. Felitti. I am honored to have the opportunity to speak to you today about your work regarding childhood trauma and its connection to addiction and illness in adulthood. And I would like to start by asking you to give a brief summary of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, otherwise known as the ACE study, and why its findings are so important in addiction treatment today.
Well, the ACE study really began by some counterintuitive findings that we made in a major obesity program that we were running here. The technique we were using for weight loss enabled us to take a person's weight down non-surgically, approximately 300 pounds in 1 year. And we, of course, assumed, isn't that wonderful? We've got this problem licked. And then some memorable patients in the middle 80s had things happen that convinced us that we had really missed the boat, that in fact obesity was not their problem. Obesity was an unconscious attempt to solve problems from years prior, because obesity offered certain advantages. I mean, get serious. How can it be good for you when there are so many bad aspects for it? Well, some things that patients told me. I remember talking with a woman going through a life year by year, and we get to age 23. She tells me that at 25, she was raped. In the year subsequent, gained 105 pounds. She looks down at the carpet and mutters, "Overweight is overlooked, and that's the way I need to be." And we ended up hearing that story one way or another from many patients, more typically women than men. Around the same time, we had two men in the program whose weight we reduced 100 and 150 pounds. They both worked as guards at the state penitentiary downtown. They made no bones about it. They were no longer comfortable walking into the cell blocks regular size. They felt a lot better looking big as a refrigerator when they walked in, bringing to mind our expression, throwing your weight around. So this was the beginning to see, led us down many trails. Why was this happening? And the trails all ended up in childhood experiences, commonly of a nature that we have all been very effectively taught as children, nice people don't talk about, my God, certainly don't ask about. The issue of childhood sexual abuse turns out to be remarkably common. Once we started going down that trail, we learned about many other forms of abuse: heavy-duty beating in childhood, heavy-duty humiliation, growing up in severe neglect, growing up in a home where one of the members of your household was an alcoholic or a drug user, where one of the members was imprisoned during your childhood without both biological parents, growing up in a home where mother was beaten frequently, etc. And ultimately, the question came up, do these things exist in a general population, or was this just some aberrant group that I had managed to put together that it was true for? I ran into some people from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and this was in 1990 now. I made a presentation at a national obesity meeting. And the presentation was really rejected. Someone in the audience got up and said that I really needed to understand that people who were more familiar with these matters, like obviously they, recognized that these statements by patients were largely fabrications to make a cover explanation for failed lives. And I remember thinking, of course, we all know that false claims of incest are made for social aggrandizement. There was a dinner for speakers that night, and seated next to me was someone from the CDC. And he said, look, you know, if what you're saying is true, it's got enormous importance for the country as well as the practice of medicine. But nobody's going to believe your 286 cases. What we need is a large epidemiologically sound study with thousands of people in it and from a general population, not limited to obesity. Well, we could do that. I had a very unusual Department of Preventive Medicine back home in San Diego here, and one division of that provided uncommonly comprehensive medical evaluation to 58,000 adults a year in this one setting. It was the largest operation of its type, certainly in the Western world, perhaps anywhere. So we spent the next 2 years planning what we were going to do. You know, how many people? Well, yeah, 26,000. We can handle that. And I remember thinking, oh my God, what have I agreed to? I was up to my knees in charts with 286 cases. Fortunately, they knew how to handle, you know, caseloads in the thousands. And so we presented the protocol for the ACE study to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, in 1994, and were turned down flat. Otherwise sensible people told us, you know, you can't ask patients these questions. You're going to cause patients to decompensate, maybe occasionally become suicidal. You simply can't do this. We spent the next 9 months battling before we finally got agreement. And the ACE study began in 1995. We asked 26,000 consecutive adults coming through if they would help us learn more about how life experiences in childhood might affect them roughly, you know, a half century later. The population was a very clearly middle-class population, almost exactly half women, half men, average age 57, 74% had been to college, 80% white, including Hispanic, 10% Black, 10% Asian. And what we learned was, I mean, it really was difficult to accept initially because the prevalence of these adverse childhood experiences was vastly higher than any of us had anticipated. And the relationship they had to damaging results roughly a half century later was really quite striking. And then we followed these patients for the next 20 years to get more detailed analysis. And what we found was these 10 categories of adverse childhood experience. A, were very common. B, tended to cause major emotional distress, which tended to trigger various coping mechanisms. Drinking, smoking. I mean, you know, we only hear smoking is bad for you. Well, there are benefits. Inhaled nicotine reduces anxiety, and it does so in 15 or 20 seconds after inhalation. But isn't it bad for you? Absolutely. Major downside, but that's 15 or 20 years away. Nicotine reduces depression. Nicotine reduces appetite. And as American Indians figured out empirically centuries ago, nicotine reduces aggression. That's why they were burning tobacco leaves in their ceremonial peace pipe, not moss or oak leaves. So that was interesting. A good example of coping mechanisms was the use of crystal meth. Everyone knows the dangers of crystal meth, et cetera, and all that stuff is true. virtually no one seems to remember that the first successful prescription antidepressant introduced for sale in the United States in the early 1940s was methamphetamine. Does it mean anything that the most common street drug is an effective antidepressant? But isn't it dangerous? Well, if you don't understand dosage, pretty much any medication is dangerous. I mean, you double your dose of digitalis, you'd be dead in 10 days on average. So dosage is a crucial issue. So part of the problem then was the damage that was produced by these various coping mechanisms, eating to feel better, and then realizing that obesity was often protective. Now, it had major downside risks. I mean, you know, I'm heavy enough, there's a good chance you become diabetic and all the risks of that, et cetera. The risk of heart disease increasing. And then a vastly more complex category of how hyperstimulation of certain areas in the brain causes the release of pro-inflammatory chemicals, and how hyperstimulation of certain other areas of the brain causes suppression of one's immune system. And those two outcomes are linked heavily towards the development of autoimmune diseases. And we studied 21 different autoimmune diseases, and we found that adverse childhood experiences had a clear dose-response relationship to the likelihood of 16 of those 21 occurring. Malignancy, cancer, you know, again, how could what happens to a little kid, you know, affect the likelihood of their having cancer 50 years later? Well, you know, smoking 3 packs a day to feel better is one answer, but that was just a little piece of the picture. The bigger piece of the picture came as a result of immune system suppression. We are all forming small numbers of cancer cells every day. Our immune systems recognize them in the background, destroy them, and we never know the difference. If there's immune system suppression, those cells are no longer destroyed, and they bloom into different kinds of cancers. So this was really staggering to realize all of this was going on unbeknownst to us. There's a fourth category that we did not study, epigenetic changes, changes in gene function, not in gene structure. Change in gene structure would be a mutation. This is like putting an on-off switch on a gene. And that's quite interesting. We didn't study it because in the early 90s, when we were putting the study together, the word epigenetics barely existed. The field has grown explosively, and you'll be hearing a great deal about that in upcoming years. But we only studied 3 of the pathways towards chronic emotional distress, towards the damage induced by various coping mechanisms like heavy smoking, overeating, heavy drinking, etc., promiscuity, and the effects caused by hyperstimulation of certain areas of the brain and the consequences of that. So that basically is the essence of the ACE study. It has attracted surprising amounts of interest really throughout the Northern Hemisphere and Australia. Quite remarkable. I mean, just this morning I got an email from someone in China who wanted some further detail on it. And it's been, pieces of it have been replicated around the world, and you know, there's no question about the relationship that these 10 categories of adverse childhood experience have to adult health, well-being, biomedical disease, and premature death later in life. We found that in the case of having any exposure to any 6 of the 10 categories, that was associated with a shortening of life expectancy of 19.7 years. So the effect of this is major.
Yes. So given these findings, I'm left with questions about working in the field of eating disorders, where there's still a significant focus on normalizing eating and weight. And some of that takes the form of structured eating, looking at certain foods that might be addictive, eliminating certain food groups in an attempt to reduce weight, and also in an attempt to not trigger an addictive reaction. And so given the findings in the ACE study that addiction isn't rooted in the substance, but rather in the trauma, I wonder what you would say to these practitioners. Is there any benefit in focusing on the way a patient is eating, or trying to help them reduce their weight? Or do you think that they might actually be causing harm by focusing on those things rather than moving into the trauma? Or is there some balance? What do you recommend?
In our obesity program here in San Diego, we have treated 30,000 people over a quarter century. We spent no time teaching people how to eat right. That's what you do when you don't know what to do.
Thank you.
We spent our time helping people discover why they began putting on weight when they did. In other words, how old were you when you first began putting on weight? And then the next question is, why do you think it began then? You know, why was it when you were 5 or 18 or 32 or 40? Why do you think it was then? And that's a crucially important question. Mm-hmm. The 2 big issues in obesity are A, the use of food for its emotional benefits. Sit down, have something to eat, you'll feel better. And then the protective benefits of obesity. If one has need because of life experiences to reduce one's sexual appeal, or to provide the illusion of, power by large size, etc., or to reduce social expectations, obesity works. Yeah. You need to desexualize yourself. Gaining 100 pounds works well. Not as good as 200, but it's a step in the right direction, etc. And so ultimately we saw that there was a real paradox that we had uncovered. Yeah. I'll refer to it as a public health paradox, that many of our most difficult public health problems are indeed that, from a social standpoint. But from the standpoint of the individual involved, are often unconscious attempts to reduce bad feelings, typically induced by something that occurred, years earlier, decades earlier, etc. And the crystal meth is a very good example. It's a lot easier to say, my kid's on that damn crystal meth because there's a dealer on the next block, than it is to say my kid's buying antidepressants on the street, which, is like, really? Why? Not a comfortable question to have to face.
Right. So a follow-up question to this is, one of the things I notice when I'm treating patients with eating disorders is that for some of them, they don't have some of those major experiences of abuse in childhood, and they tend to really minimize the things that actually happen to them. So as they're describing incidents in childhood that to me really represent trauma, for them, they don't think it's really traumatic. They think it's small compared to something someone else went through. And so a lot of the work seems to be in helping them to recognize the, you know, the pain that they're actually in, and that the denial of that is part of why they are still relying on food and on weight to, you know, suppress those feelings and those memories.
One thing that we found is that if one attempts to get this information face to face, you know, which would be the typical approach, there are a lot of problems. For one thing, if you're new at this and not experienced in asking these questions and express any discomfort, you know, like, I want you to understand, I ask all my patients questions like this. You're not having any problems at home, are you? Yeah, right. Okay. So after you embarrass yourself a couple of times doing that, then you figure, well, the hell with this. I'm not going near that approach anymore. You know, we're going to send people to the dietitian. Get them out of the office. We found that routinely getting this information by a very well-devised and detailed paper-based questionnaire filled out at home, not on some clipboard in the waiting room, worked remarkably well. Because the other interpersonal difficulties that one, well, this doctor's too young to, this one's too old to understand. You know, I'd rather talk with the lady doctor, or I'm not comfortable talking with the lady doctor about this, or I'd rather talk with somebody who's Vietnamese or Polish like me that would understand, etc. And somehow the use of a well-devised questionnaire, you know, really, well, 30,000 people in the weight program, you know, it was really remarkable what we got in terms of information. And then in terms of the ACE study, well, it was 17,500 people in the ACE study that we followed for 20 years, starting with this very detailed question, step one. And then as a result of that, when we integrated it into our practice in the department, where we asked everyone these questions, you know, blended in with questions like, have you ever had kidney stones or a heart attack or things like that. What we learned was really quite extraordinary. And a big surprise is that appeared to be de-stressing to patients. In, I guess it was around the year 2000 when it had become obvious that we had stumbled into something really big here, and decided to, you know, integrate this into everyday work in the department, the comprehensive medical evaluation process I mentioned before. A German mathematician at UCSD came by. He had a startup data mining company that's on the New York Stock Exchange now, and he offered to do a 130,000 patient study, 2.5 years throughput for the department, to see whether the addition of these trauma-oriented questions had any discernible effect. Incredibly, he found it triggered a 35% reduction in doctor office visits the next year compared to the year before for that group, and an 11% reduction in emergency room visits. Now, the dollar value of that is extraordinary. I mean, that has implications in the multi-billion-dollar range, and it's attracted the attention of a number of state governments who see the value of this in terms of its implications for their state Medicaid budgets. How that will play out over time is yet to be determined, but, you know, the potential there is rather striking.
So I had a follow-up question. It sounds like there's just tremendous value in being able to just report the information. And I know from having heard you speak before that often patients experience a real lift in their depression just from having someone ask the question and really listen to the answer and understand. And I wonder,
there's a piece that's important there, and it took us a while to figure it out. and implicitly accept that person. You know, I told the doctor or the nurse practitioner, you know, this terrible story about myself, and they still treated me nice afterwards. They wanted me to come back. And I realized that we had created an analog of confession in the Catholic Church.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm not saying that as a religious person, because I'm not, but confession is a very interesting process. I mean, it's been in use for 1,800 years, suggesting, you know, maybe it meets some basic human need, like being able to tell somebody important to you something terrible about yourself, and coming out a minute or two later realizing that, you know, I still seem to be accepted here.
Right. And that's such an important part of psychotherapy. And we as marriage and family therapists, we have a lot of people coming into the office that are struggling with various kinds of addictions, and particularly with eating disorders. There's so much shame around either, you know, having your weight go up and being what we call fat, right, which is a very shame-based word even to use, or people who are overeating and then they're purging or using laxatives or some other way of trying to minimize what they consider both the damage to their bodies and really hiding from people that they're using food in this way to help with depression and anxiety, and that there's so much value in helping patients tell their story, listen. As you said, there's an accepting quality so that people feel still this surprise that they're still valued after they've told the story that they have a lot of shame about. Do you have any other you know, words of wisdom or things that you would suggest for psychotherapists to deepen their work when people do come into treatment for eating disorders and the trauma that they've experienced in early childhood?
I think probably the biggest idea to come out of this is the importance of a really comprehensive, you know, I would call it a medical history, life history, going back to the very beginning, because it's all too easy. Wow, that happened 50 years ago. I mean, come on, you know, kids are resilient, they get over that, et cetera, et cetera. And dismiss it when in fact those things have extraordinary ability to manifest themselves throughout the rest of a person's life. Well, I mean, 19.7 years of reduced life expectancy is a pretty impressive thing. You've mentioned the term addiction several times, and something comes up that's an interesting story. When I grew up, everybody, you know, used to say, well, you take heroin enough times, you're not going to be able to stop, you know, it's addicting, etc. A woman named Louise Robbins, did a very important study in the Vietnam War. She interviewed in Vietnam 890, well, it was 890 some patients, American soldiers, who acknowledged to her, but not to the army, that they had used heroin daily for at least the prior 30 days. Okay, so, you know, by anyone's criteria, an addict. She then met with them 8 months after they had returned to the United States. Had to go all over the country to find them and so on. The incredible thing was that 8 months after being at home, 94% of them were no longer using heroin. No treatment. Kind of shakes your confidence. Conventional, you know, explanation of addiction being substance dependent, as opposed to experience dependent.
Yes, it's an important area that seems to be getting a lot of attention now in the news. Johann Hari has a New York Times bestseller called Lost Connections. And I was listening to an interview with him, and he was talking about this doctor that he had interviewed in San Diego that had really been the pivot point in his breakthrough to understanding the causes of depression and addiction. And, you know, his book, last week, there wasn't a bookstore in the country that had it on the shelves. It was sold out on Amazon, and I think it still is. So he talked about you, Dr. Felitti, and how important you were to him, both personally and as a journalist reporting on the story of, you know, what really causes addiction, and, you know, separating the idea of a substance, whether, you know, it's sugar or heroin or nicotine or whatever it is, from the kind of support and connection that people have in their lives. So now the ACE study findings are really being thrust into a very large arena. They're really in the popular conversation and psyche, and starting to raise these very important questions about what is addiction. And I was wondering what your thoughts are, and also what your hopes are for you know, the way this information is now making it out into these large areas and becoming a conversation, and what you hope to see from this.
It really is interesting where it's catching on, because it's catching on in small towns more than in big cities. It's catching on in police departments. Mm-hmm. A couple of months ago, I was invited to a very large meeting in West Virginia that the West Virginia State Police had put on about the ACE study.
Wow.
It's catching on in judicial circles. I have a upcoming invitation to speak at a major judicial meeting in Florida next month. Did I mention schools and grammar schools and high schools? It's really catching on. It has been resisted significantly thus far in medical settings. I think that's beginning to change, but, you know, change is slow. I think a big change could occur if we had a system wherein a really comprehensive medical history, a lifetime medical history, was collected on the internet and made available to physicians without being, you know, enormously costly in terms of time. And it's my hope that we might be able to stimulate people who are developing electronic medical records to make this a part of the EMR, to collect a detailed medical history on the internet at home, and then tune this up in the office, you know. So that would be one thing. And another big issue is dealing with these problems after the fact is extremely difficult, time-consuming, costly. We'll never have the resources to do it across the population. And that raises the issue, well, what could be done to prevent them in the first place? So-called primary prevention. No one knows how to do that yet, but it's the right question to focus on. And I believe that if we could figure out how to improve parenting skills across the nation, that would have an enormously beneficial impact. Because the fact is that most of us, when we become parents, you know, at best are going to be well-intentioned, but really have no idea what the details are that are going to be needed as an infant develops. So those two big ideas, detailed medical history routinely available on everyone coming in, and secondly, trying to figure out what we could do to improve parenting skills across the entire nation.
Yes.
As opposed to fixing them after the fact, which is a huge act of kindness. You can learn a great deal doing that, but the fact is the work is so difficult and so massive that we'll never be able to take it on that way. Primary prevention.
And one of the things I've noticed is as we're working hard to destigmatize going to psychotherapy, And we have more and more patients coming in who are coming to therapy because they have issues and they're deeply concerned about not being able to parent their children in the ways that they want to because they're depressed or they're anxious or they're not able to really establish an intimate connection with their children. And so the hope is that destigmatization and also the access to mental health care would give people the opportunity to work on themselves, work through their childhood traumas, and in a sense, then not pass it on to the next generation. And that's core to what marriage and family therapists do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is there anything else you would like to share before we call this to a close?
Well, for people working in the field, a useful thing to keep in mind, we made a one-page version of the ACE study questionnaire for people to use and become familiar with. We found it very helpful, and I did this at the medical school in Iceland 2 years ago when I was there. I asked the dean the month before I got there to have the medical students anonymously fill out the one-page ACE questionnaire and then pool the data and send me the pooled data. So I put that up as a slide from an unidentified population. What do you guys think this means? A very active discussion. I only wish that I had had the foresight of having someone photograph their faces when I told them that it was they themselves that they had been discussing.
Yeah.
It's a useful technique. So if somebody is working in juvenile hall, what if you could get 30 or 50 kids together, fill it out anonymously, put the results. What do you guys think this means? I mean, hey, I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about everybody else in the room, etc. Yeah. So there's a real advantage in that approach of enabling people to speak, but not having to identify themselves. Talking about everyone in the room, not just me.
It makes me think about earlier in our conversation, you mentioned, if a kid grows up in a home where one of the parents is incarcerated, that's, one of the check marks on the list. And I would love to see that kind of questionnaire be given to people that are currently incarcerated, because I think there's so little understanding of the kind of trauma that is underneath, things that get people thrown into jail, and then including also the people that are there for mental health issues and addiction issues. And I think,
absolutely. And in this vein, school shooters represent an excellent example because, yes. And I have really been looking for this in particular, reliably absent from any article about a school shooter is any meaningful information about who raised these kids, yeah, or didn't.
Yeah.
It's like, this is a forbidden subject. Nice people don't talk, the kid's no good. The kid's the murderer. Parents had nothing to do with it. There's a book called Listening to Killers, written by the American psychologist James Garbarino. And he spent a great deal of time interviewing people on death row. And that's what the book is about, what the lives of these individuals were like. And I mean, one readily comes to the conclusion that murderers are created at home. No, they're not born, they're created at home. A very difficult subject. And hence we tend to avoid certain key aspects of this, like you can't ask patients questions like that, you're going to cause people to decompensate, etc. Or my colleagues saying to me, you're crazy, you can't ask patients. They'll be furious and no one will tell you the truth anyway. Well, ultimately we did this over a multi-year period with 440,000 adults here in San Diego, Kaiser members. And the amazing thing is that there wasn't one patient complaint.
Right. And in fact, you tell the story of the woman who was so grateful because she was afraid. Was she in her 90s?
Yeah.
And she was really afraid that no one would ever know. No one would ever know what happened to her.
Yes.
I think people really want to tell their story, and they want to know that someone's interested.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the really great gifts of this study, is to understand that when you're looking at someone and what they did versus looking at someone and what happened to them. I think that's a quote that's somewhere in the Johann Hari book, that the people aren't just born this way, that they're traumatized. And I think once we can start looking at people in that way with more of a sense of humanity and compassion, we as a society will be safer and we will be healthier.
Yeah, certainly so.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why whenever I speak, I always have patient video clips where the patient makes the key point, not some guy in a suit from out of town, but a patient is making the key point.
Yes. Yes. Well, I want to thank you from my heart to yours for taking the time to talk to us today. We're so excited about having you back at our annual conference, and that we're going to have an afternoon with you and Dr. Gabor Mate together, which is like my dream. So I'm super happy about that. And I'm really looking forward to it, as I know we all are.
Well, see you up there then.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Felitti.
Nice talking with you.
You too.